So the cancer landscape is actually very exciting if you're looking at the research. After they mapped the human genome years ago, it's finally starting to bring dividends in the actual laboratory and in the development of drugs. And you're starting to, oncologists are starting to look at lung cancer, for example, not as lung cancer, but as lung cancer with genome X, Y, and Z. And different drugs will work for different types of cancer and different genome types. And they've also found breakthroughs in revving up the immune system to fight cancers, and there are many exciting new drugs in that area. And in the future, I think we're going to see some great breakthroughs on gene therapies. You know, this CRISPR technology where they can edit out a faulty gene and replace it with a healthy one is very exciting. I read about a trial the other day where they're doing that in immune cells. They're changing the DNA in an immune cell and making it a very aggressive immune cell that will attack cancer cells. So there's a lot of promise and R&D. There'll be some challenges with this, though. You know, if you ask me about patients and physicians, cancer care is going to be much more complicated. Yeah. You know, you're going to get a diagnosis of cancer, and you're going to go to an oncologist, and they're going to say, "Whoa, there's this therapy, and you're this genome type," and so that's why I think organizations like RCA have a very valuable role to play in education and educating patients about the complications that will come. As far as funders are concerned, I think there's a big challenge emerging in the future that when you start to create subpopulations of cancer patients, say 250,000 people in the U.S. are diagnosed with lung cancer every year about. Well, if you look at a subgroup, it only may be 25,000 patients. And if a pharmaceutical company is going to spend $600 million developing a product for only 25,000 patients, that product is going to be more expensive. That's just the economics.
Exactly.
When you have a small customer base and you've spent hundreds of millions on research, it's going to be more expensive. And I think funders are going to have to look at creative ways to pay for these things. And I think there are some interesting reimbursement strategies that could be out there in the future, which we could talk about later.
In Australia, most analyses for new medicine approvals are based on something called QALYs, which is an estimate of health outcomes based on impacts to length and a patient's quality of life. So you've mentioned concerns around these. What are those concerns, and do we have better measures we could be using?
So I've spent a lot of time looking at this, and when I first started to address it, I thought, well, I'm not a health economist. I have a PhD, but I'm not a health economist. Am I going to be able to address this properly? And the more I scratched the surface of it, the more I realized that a lot of these tools are very arbitrary. Subjective. There are tools that are not subjective. You know, if you take your temperature because you're feeling warm and you're 101, that's a pretty objective measure, and that's important. These cost-effectiveness tools are not objective measures.
It's funny you say that because I think they were put in place to try and make them objective and less subjective.
Well, they give the fig leaf of objectivity, but let me put it in simple terms. So the QALY is called the Quality Adjusted Life Year, and they rate medicines according, as you said, their ability to extend life and improve quality of life. I mean, it's common sense, right? You get medicines that make you live longer and live better, they should be more valued. Where the arbitrariness creeps in is they establish a monetary threshold for life. They say, okay, in the US, they say a year of life lived in perfect health is worth about $150,000.
I've seen a big range for these, from 50 up to $1 million or $2 million.
Yeah, it's less in Great Britain. I don't know what it is in Australia, but they put this threshold in this. And in my mind, that's sort of arbitrary, right? If it were $1 million, then most drugs would be rated as cost effective. If it were $1,000, no drugs would be rated as cost effective. And so you can adjust that threshold up and down to reach certain conclusions that you want to reach. And when it comes to rare disease drugs, which, as we talked about, are generally more expensive, the thresholds aren't high enough because they're by definition going to be more expensive than other drugs that treat 1 million people. So I have all sorts of problems and complaints, some of them related specifically to cancer.
Yep.
I do think, for example, some of these cost effectiveness tools do not consider the monetary costs of caregivers. You know, so one study I read said most caregivers for cancer patients spend 30 hours a week. So that means a spouse has to go part-time, you have to hire a nurse, or you have to do something that's going to cost the patient money.
If someone can go back to work or not, I think is important as well.
Exactly.
Flow-on impacts.
And if a drug's invented that allows caregivers more time to themselves, more time to work, you don't have to hire that nurse, why shouldn't that value be included in the drug? I don't understand that. And I think the reason is they don't want the drug to, they want to knock the price of the drug down as far as they possibly can.
So thank you for summarizing your concerns with those cost-effectiveness tools. Are there any better measures that you've heard about or that you really support?
Well, I can't say I support it, but I've looked at other cost-effectiveness regimes that seem to do it a little better than the quality countries. Germany, for example. One of the problems with the quality analysis is many times it's done right after a clinical trial, and the data's not very robust, right? You might have 20,000 people, but that's not a lot. I've been told by one research scientist that you really need to put it into 300,000 people before you really know how a drug is going to work. So Germany, for example, has a system in which they allow the pharma company to put the drug on the market after it's approved and sell it at any price.
Any price?
For a year.
Wow.
And then after a year, they have very robust data. It's been put in tens of thousands of patients, many more than clinical trials.
And they're consistently collecting that.
Yeah, and then they go back and they say, okay, your price was too high. You have to rebate some of that money back to us. Or we're going to set it a little lower. We're going to set it a little higher even.
Yep.
But at least they're making the cost effectiveness judgment based on a good amount of data and how well it's working in a patient's body. And that's my preference, is to have some more robust data. I'm not endorsing the German system. I actually prefer the American system, to be frank. I mean, U.S. patients get access to 87% of the new drugs that go on the market within 0 to 3 months. They get access. Now, the U.S. system has all sorts of problems. We have uninsured people. People may pay a lot of out-of-pocket costs and other challenges. But the system gets new drugs to patients very, very quickly. And the reason it does that is it has kind of a free market system. We have a lot of private commercial health plans, and they know they have to have a quality formulary of drugs to attract patients. And so when new drugs come out, they tend to want to put them on if they have good data and make them available. And a market like that, I think, is so much better than a bunch of pointy-headed guys with slide rules looking at all the data saying, this drug is not allowed and that one is. I just don't think people are that smart. I think 1 million people making the decision is better. Patients, caregivers, relatives, patient advocates, physicians, insurance companies, they all get together and they decide this is working well or it's not working well. It's worth the money or it's not worth the money.
Are there models, you mentioned the German one, any other models that helps keep an eye on sustainability but improves access as well?
Yeah, I think there are some clever things that could be done that would help with that problem. I mean, generally, if you have a single-payer health care system where the government is paying all the costs, you run into this problem where they set a budget for the next year, then they get into that budget year, and a couple new drugs come along that are going to be somewhat expensive. And they say it's not in the budget.
Yep.
And so they're not made available. And that's one of the Australian system. I'm not telling Australians how they should structure their healthcare system, but that's one of the drawbacks is they don't have access to new medicines as quickly as Americans. And Americans pay more, and that's part of the drawback of the American system. And so you just have to choose. But there are clever things you can do. For example, with many of these new expensive drugs, say you have an oncology drug that the manufacturer said, this is going to make you live 2 years longer. It could be 2 years of life. The government could say, okay, put your money where your mouth is. We'll pay you 1/3 in the beginning, 1/3 at year 1, and the final third at year 2. And if you make it to year 2, you'll get fully paid for the medicine. But if you don't,
if they live until year 2.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and that's what they claim. So spread out the payments so that if a new drug comes along, the government doesn't get hit with a big bill for all the cost of the medicine. They say, show us the value, and if you prove the value, we'll pay you all along. So I think there are things that can be done like that people should be thinking about, because we have many new expensive drugs coming for rare diseases, and somebody ought to be thinking about how to pay for them without busting the budget. And again, not to criticize the Australian system, but Australians get access to about 40% of the new drugs, and they wait on average about 20 months for those new drugs.
Longer than Americans.
And the Americans get access to about 87% of new drugs within 0 to 3 months.
Yeah.
So the difference is significant. And again, Americans pay for it. I will admit that.
Yeah.
They pay higher prices. They pay more for their health care, but they also have better access, which is what you'd expect if you're paying more.
So this year, the Rare Cancers Australia team are focusing on the concept of patient rights in terms of their cancer treatment and their experience. What do you think about that? Does that resonate with you? And what do you think patients, if so, what do you think patients should be able to expect in terms of rights?
Well, when it comes to human life, of course, there should be a focus on rights. People should have a right to certain medicines that are going to save their life, and just like they should have access to food and water. But the issue is not rights. The issue is the practical policies that you need to put in place to give them access to do that. You know, if I'm going to say people have a right to food, I'm not just going to talk to the philosopher. I'm going to talk to the farmer and say, okay, how can we generate more food? And so it's incumbent upon patient advocates, policymakers, and others to say, okay, there's an access problem here. What can we do to fix it? And to spend a lot of time talking about the practical issues. Everybody generally accepts the idea that people have a right to these medicines. What's the practical solution to getting it to them? That's the question.
Yeah, and I agree with you. Everyone has to kind of come together to make that work.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. In one of your thought leadership reports, you outline why access to clinical trials and use of the data from clinical trials is a challenge. What are these challenges, and why is this important in terms of approving new cancer medicines?
Yeah, I wrote about this in the context of cancer cost-effectiveness reviews. More than any other therapeutic area, the patients who are in a clinical trial for a cancer medicine are more unrepresentative than the patients who will actually take the medicine. So if you do a quality cost-effectiveness review after the clinical trials are over and it's a lung cancer drug, and say it's given 6 additional months of life, but it has some quality of life issues associated with it, so it doesn't get a very good score as a drug. But then an oncologist experimenting around gives it to a colorectal cancer patient, and suddenly that patient lives 2 years and has fewer side effects. Well, does the medicine still keep the bad score that it got when it was first reviewed, or do they update the reviews? And I'm not sure they always do. And there's so much experimentation going on in cancer that doing the cost-effectiveness review right after the clinical trials is not terribly relevant in my mind. And that's the problem I have with it. I just think they got to look at cancer medicines in a different way when they do these cost-effectiveness reviews, where they get more robust data. Maybe they adopt the German model. I don't know what they do. They just have to change it, because they're not doing cost-effectiveness models on the patients that really matter, the patients who are going to take the medicine.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that. I did a project a few years ago looking at the pipeline for cancer medicines, and I was surprised by, overall the benefit wasn't that great. A few extra months lived, but for, 10-20% of the population, life-changing, cancer's gone, things like that. And I think potentially the genetic component or a better understanding of these patients will be able to better target who really benefits and what does that mean, because it all gets washed out in the overall data.
And if you get the robust data, the 20% that thrive on this particular medicine, you could say for this population, the drug can be this costly.
Yeah.
For these populations, we don't recommend it. And that's the way it should be done. And it's not being done terribly effectively now, in my view.
That brings us to an interesting idea, an emerging science around personalized medicine, or what some would call precision medicine, which is healthcare based on a person's genetic profile. It's exciting and interesting and complex. Genetics can explain in some cases why some people may get cancer and why some may respond or not to a certain medicine, as we've talked about. As this area of research develops, it is likely that we're going to get more and more subgroups, smaller populations. How should decision makers and funders plan for this? And an additional question to consider is, do pharmaceutical companies have a greater moral obligation in terms of this to help make these medicines accessible compared to other for-profit industries and businesses?
Yes, very good question. We've talked about some of this already. That, policymakers need to prepare for this, because you can't do big cost effectiveness reviews if medicine is completely personalized, right? How are you going to look at how this drug that 40,000 patients took, how well it did, when, as we said, it might work for 10% of the population really well and for 30% of the population really poorly. You need to figure out how to do a cost effectiveness reviews that takes all this personalized medicine into account. And I'm not sure, this personalized medicine has the potential to make these cost effectiveness reviews completely obsolete. And it also has the potential, believe it or not, to cut drug costs, because if you can do a diagnostic test,
exactly.
you don't have to give the $100,000 medicine to 50,000 people. You may just have to give it to 5,000 people. So the more personalized the medicine is, the more cost effective you can be in dispensing it. So I'm generally encouraged about personalized medicine and genomics. As far as the question about pharmaceutical companies having a moral obligation, they have a moral obligation because they make a life-saving product to make sure that people who can't afford it can afford it some way.
Yeah.
And in the United States, I don't know what happens in Australia, but in the United States, they give away medicine for free. Mm-hmm. They give coupons to lower-income people to help them pay for out-of-pocket costs. And then they also give very deep discounts to government programs that serve the poor. And some of these programs have very, very low prices from pharmaceutical companies. And they have an obligation to do that. And I wouldn't say all industries have an obligation to do that. If you're a company that mines diamonds, you don't have an obligation to see to it that low-income people can afford diamonds. You don't, because it's not a life-saving product. But I think life-saving products create different moral rules for these companies.
Do you have any insights on how we can make sure that those real-world outcomes are measured consistently and in a way that patients can influence what is valuable to them?
Yes, the provisional model is not just a German model. For cancer, it's now the British model, right? The Cancer Drugs Fund will pay for these cancer therapies until the cost-effectiveness people decide.
Right, okay.
So I think
it's a stopgap, really. Then.
It's a very worthy model, and it's a particularly worthy model in rare diseases and rare cancers, because the data is not robust. It's very hard and expensive to run a clinical trial for a rare disease. So making these rare disease drugs provisionally available, even before somebody's decided about formulary status, to get more robust data, I think is a really good idea.
And how have you seen anywhere do it really well to capture what patients want in terms of outcomes that are measured?
No. I'm sorry to say that, but
I think it's a space that needs to evolve.
Yeah, the quality cost effectiveness reviews, for example, do not take patients into consideration in the way that they should. Not at all. In fact, on quality of life assessments, they poll the general public, not the people with just the disease itself. So
it's hard to understand how you might feel as someone with cancer.
Right. So they're going to rate pain. How important is pain in this? And they ask a member of the general public, not somebody who's experienced cancer. That makes no sense to me. And patient input is extremely important, and it's not carefully considered by many of these systems.
Okay, that's an area that needs to evolve.
Absolutely.
It seems, yeah. Based on what you see globally, what gives you the most hope in terms of saving lives for cancer patients in the next kind of 5 to 10 years?
That's a very good question, and I'm very excited about the prospects. My wife used to work for the former Harvard president, Larry Summers, and he knew all about all the exciting life sciences things that were going on at Harvard Medical School and research. And in his stump speeches, he used to say, if science were art, we are now in the high Renaissance. We're in the greatest period of human discovery and creativity ever in the history of life sciences. And I know a lot of people are concerned about costs, and they wring their hands and all these things. There's so much exciting things happening the cost issue is this big compared to all the exciting potential discoveries that are going to come through. And I just hope that people keep this going. They don't enact policies that are going to slow it down.
That's a great answer. And it's great to hear that it's going to be game-changing stuff in the future and inspiring for the cancer community back home in Australia. So on behalf of everyone there, thank you very much, Dr. William Smith.
Thank you again for having me.